Venri Chapter 11. Meanwhile, in an elevator, Shepard had asked, "All right, Garrus and Tally, reasons why, even though we're screwed, there are advantages to now versus then." Shepard can't drive the Mako. Elevator rides are faster. We don't have to deal with Udina. Tally wins. Timeline. Stop the collectors. Acquire Reaper IFF. Shepard. Garrus wasn't happy with bringing home a Geth with a sniper rifle. That wasn't hard to tell. "Leave it. We have enough trouble," was barely restrained, angry code for, "Are you fucking kidding me?" Followed up by, "You know the risk. That's all I'm going to say." Which she assumed meant that was all he was going to say about it then, but he'd have more to say about it later. That was before she'd made the choice to bring it along. Then just icy silence and glaring. Not at her. Definitely not at her, just glaring at anything but her. A Geth that spoke to her could be invaluable. Of course, a Geth that hijacked the Normandy could be terrible, so she'd make sure the first thing happened and the second didn't. How? She'd figure that bit out later. Edie could help. In theory. Just in case the IFF wasn't complicated enough. Sure. First, she had to handle this. Garrus would not appreciate being handled. Oh well. He'd avoided her and headed to the battery. When she arrived, he didn't turn around. Only said, "This isn't a good time." "I know, but it's the only time I have." He said, just a little bit louder, as though she hadn't heard him the first time. "I've got some work to do here." "Yes, and I'm going to undo everything you do with a few additions if you ignore me. Hell, I'll have Edie send me reports on your progress, and I'll get subtle with my damage where you can't find it. I'll also find a hammer. I'll requisition a hammer." He turned to look at her and said, dripping contempt, "If you're going to be juvenile..." She cut him off before she got really, really angry. It's possible that line had already been crossed. "If I, or we, are going to be juvenile, I'd prefer to do it somewhere with better soundproofing. We can do it here, or we can do it in our quarters. I'd prefer our quarters because we have some emotionally fragile people on this cruise, and I'd prefer to not unhinge them further. But don't mistake me. I'm willing to screech and bang and cry right here if you won't move the proceedings. I'll cry in front of Jack. I'll call Jack in here, and it will scar the shit out of that girl. Not everyone's tough enough to handle crying maturely, so I don't have to beat the crap out of them for their reaction. Come up in a few minutes. If we walk out of here together the way we look right now, people will be talking about us instead of the Geth." She gestured toward his hands. "Try to unclench your fists." Garrus looked down at his hands, sighed, and shook them out. She got to their quarters and moved the table out of the way in case things got rowdy, which she was not discounting at this point in time. She had a tendency to make people angry. Garrus came through a few minutes later, looked at the room, and leaned back against the door. "Expecting trouble?" She tilted her head back and forth as though she were considering different sides of the issue, and then said, "You sure you didn't bring any with you?" He said, as though speaking to a dense child, "Have I ever, even once, countermanded an order you gave?" Maybe she should have asked him nicely to come up here. She hadn't said please. Too late now. She said, "Absolutely not. Not once, even if you disagreed. Vehemently. Like now. Yes, exactly like now, except that now it isn't just an order, and you're not just an excellent soldier who happens to be a Taurian that respects orders and backs up his commander. Now it's not just your death on the line, it's your life on the line. It's not just my life. And I respect that. Is that why you moved the furniture? She was getting more than a little angry herself now, but tried not to step into obvious traps. This wasn't about her. He was just deflecting. She said, "Because I respect you? Yes. Plus, you're scary, and I'm resourceful." He smiled in an appropriately scary way. There were teeth. She wanted to lick his teeth, but this probably wasn't the time. She smiled in return, but not with menace. So, this is what happens when scariness and resourcefulness become drawbacks to a personal relationship. That thing shouldn't be on this ship. I'm not just scary, I'm a tech expert. Yes, you are. Come on, tell me. It's your life, it's my life. You should have the opportunity to express yourself outside the moment. Express myself? I'm not saying you can override me on a commanded decision when we're out in the field, but I am saying you have the right to say what you feel after. It's the best I can do. Maybe you'll change my mind. Right. That's a trap right there. She raised a brow. You don't think I value your opinion? You value my opinion. We agree often. When we don't agree, you happen to be in command. And you are in the unfortunate position of having to listen to my crazy ass, so come on, let me have it. So we, what, fight about it? You can break things, but the fish tank and the hamster cage are off limits. I have no interest in fighting the hamster, or the fish, or you. Okay, then just talk. He shook his head and pushed off the door, came toward her and took her hands in his, and then held them over his head, saying, "Ambush." What? Come on! Fuck, I can never tell if you're lying, stupid Taurian face. Ambush. So what has you wanting to beat me up and give me a lecture? She looked at her hands, and then at him. Holy crap, cheater! He nodded, lifted her by both hands separately at the wrists, and then held her against a wall with his knee between her legs, and said, "Kick, and I stand on your feet." She relaxed, cracked her neck. This is absolutely not going the way I thought it would. Yeah, that you'd beat the crap out of me? I wouldn't. Well, maybe. He made an unmistakable sound of anger. No need to be translated. Not maybe. We haven't sparred before, but I'm not doing it now. It's possible you won't recognize any actual limits, and you'd kick the hell out of me full bore while I was busy trying to pull punches. She tried to de-escalate. Shit, you've been paying attention. It wasn't my intention, though. Considering the position that I'm in right now, I think it's possible that you're angry. She met his eyes and held them. Perhaps if you are right, then I'm very dangerous and you don't have an exit strategy from this position without me taking out the backs of your knees. For instance. I'm not even mentioning the possibilities with biotics. I didn't, however, sucker punch you when you entered the room. I also don't think you want to hurt me. You will have to let me go at some point. He held her gaze and glared back. I'm not sure I'm considering that as a viable option. She still wanted to lick his teeth. Still not the right time. Unfortunately. Instead, she said, "Oh, sure, you can hold the crazy woman to the wall. You can even punch her and knock her out, but careful if you do. And what happens in a few awkward hours when your arms get tired? And all I have to say is, Garrus, I have to pee." Gonna feel pretty silly then. He closed his eyes, tilted his head down, and almost laughed. She could hear it in his breathing. Then he said, "So, if I ask you nicely, you won't take out my knees and you won't retaliate?" "Yes, you don't even have to ask. Trust me. We can escalate again at any point, and that's okay with me too. I can even spar in a fair manner, as long as we do it so we take off a piece of armor once someone makes a salient point or their opponent has to tap out. Pick a side. Talk. Or wrestle." "You're betting on me not wanting to wrestle?" "I'm predicting you have some things to say. Wrestling later is always an option. In fact, I might insist." He gripped her wrists tighter for a moment, and she imagined her bones bending. But he made a decision, released her hands, and backed away. "All right, say what you wanted to say." Looking at him, she realized he wasn't going to risk his knees. He wasn't going to turn his back on her. He could have stayed at the door and sniped at her, but he'd closed the distance. Why? In this moment, he didn't trust her to not hurt him. He'd restrained her not to hurt her, but to protect himself. He wasn't as aware of his own body language as she was aware of hers. He relied on his stillness and his distance, and she always had to be aware of every up-close nuance of voice and line of her body or someone else's body to get what she wanted, turn something her way. He'd backed away from her. The vulnerability of that was like a scream in the room that only she could hear. He didn't even think to conceal it or alter it. So him being angry at her wasn't the answer, or not the full answer. Angry at her effect on him. He felt helpless. She made him feel helpless. She changed course to triangulate again, confirm her sense of him, saying, "I really didn't think that far ahead. I've said what I was going to say. I've done a lot for you to be angry about. I'm not easy to live with, or work with, or talk to on strategic matters. It wasn't that much of an ambush. I wanted you genuinely to have a chance to say whatever it is you wanted to say. I wanted to let you be angry about it, and I wanted to be prepared for that." "You say that now." "You weren't next to you when I brought that thing on board." "I was." "All right. Yes, I was angry. You've had crew members angry at you before. You've had me angry at you before. This isn't new." "I'm not in love with other crew members. It matters. Yeah, I have to go out and put you at risk and put myself at risk and make a crazy-ass call that I can't explain because of my thought process. But you can explain your thought process. You have the words. I don't. For me, it's not about a geth. It's about me not having much time left with you, and I won't waste it in separate rooms. You said my pleasure and distress sounds are the same. Sometimes your pleasure and distress sounds are the same as well. Growling. I did not growl. It was implied. Angry Garrus was a brick wall. Right now he was going to play purely defensive. Batting at him would only make him turtle up. What to do with a predator? Don't attack. Run away. Maybe he'll chase. So she said carefully, Okay, if you don't want to talk and you don't want to wrestle, I apologize. Everything is fine. Nothing needs to be said. I overreacted, and I relinquish my hammer. I didn't move the furniture because I was planning on hurting you. I moved the furniture because I planned on you being hurt when you arrived. If you're not, it was a bad instinct, and I apologize. She shook her head briefly, looking like part confusion and part concession. An opportunity for you to express is not a demand that you express. You expressed that you have no interest in expressing. Okay. He shook his head. I'm confused. I mean, really confused. She shook her head to look as though she were sympathizing, but she was not confused. She said, Yeah, so am I. Too much stuff going on. I apologize. If she encouraged him to protect her from her own foolishness, maybe he'd feel safe enough to talk. He closed his eyes and paused to think. So you threatened an angry Torian and then cleared the furniture to give him space to beat on you in case it came to that? The harsh edge of his voice was fading. She loved his edge and even his harsh, but directed at her it was... What? Painful? Not exactly. She imagined briefly a world where he was nothing but angry at her. She was sure she'd still want to... She regretted not taking more advantage of when he had her against the wall, because that had real potential. She began to question her entire reason for starting this conversation. Was it to help him? Was it to ease any guilt she might have? Was it just because she'd rather argue with him than do anything else? Something more constructive? She analyzed her own anger and motivation and came up empty other than she just wanted him near all the time, and being far was unacceptable. It wasn't a weakness exactly. It was a reason to live. A really good reason to live. She said, Seemed like a good idea at the time? I don't know. I just know that you're angry. You've been angry. I found you angry. You're still angry. And I maybe only have a few days left to see if you aren't going to be angry. I think I'm okay with it, and then I'm not. I'm okay with it again. I wasn't intending to poke at you until you exploded and did something sexy. He closed his eyes. Only a few days left? We're getting close to the end here. I believe my own PR. I'm about to lose people I care for. People I'm responsible for. People who are counting on me. Maybe you. Maybe me. I know that you think it's selfish that I want it to be me. I know. This is where our opinions differ and always will. It's not an acceptable loss, my Venri. And it's the one that you're planning in your head. That's part of why I'm angry. I can't convince you that your life is more valuable than mine, no matter how many sexy things I do. You really thought I'd hurt you? No, I mean, it's always a possibility. You're big and fast, and you have a stupid lying Turian face, but no. You could break me in half. You wouldn't, though. I really wouldn't hurt you, either. I'm just trying to figure out what you need. Stories about stress and tiebreakers, planning for difficult missions. I'm new at this. Give me a break. You were looking for a reenactment? My plan wasn't that specific. The inside of my head is not a place where things become clear, in focus, like a picture. I'm more about patterns over time than one moment in time. I don't have much time, and there isn't much of a pattern so far between the two of us. It isn't a huge question like, does Garrus love me? Because I know that answer. It isn't a question like, do I love Garrus? Because I know that answer too. We've nearly bled to death in front of each other, but we haven't had unguarded, unhurried, and unworried time together. I essentially only know you under stress. We're both so busy guarding each other from our own internal turmoil. You've held me in your arms and tried to keep me from dying. I've done the same for you, but we did those things alone. I didn't let you see the pain I was in. You didn't let me see the pain you were in. We're both protective. There's nowhere safer for me than in your arms, in your heart. But if you felt anywhere near as terrified when I was near death as I felt when you were near death, there's a depth, a trove, a richness of pain that I have caused you to experience. I hear in your voice that you're terrified for me, and sometimes of me. We've missed, hidden, or concealed so much of our own history. I know it's wise that we do. I know it's circumstance. I know we also thrive on the unspoken. We can't spend our days letting our heart's blood splash the walls. It would upset the children. But I can't help but want you to see that when you worry, when you're scared, when you're angry at me, I feel it. It matters. I may not be able to change what I'm doing. I'm still willing to flat out fight you for the right to talk to that stupid Geth, but only because I think it would be better for us. Despite the risk, ultimately better. Eventually better. I know not better right now, but I can't sacrifice what I believe to make my life easier. I see your face, I hear your voice, and I can't... God, Garrus, I don't want to torture you, but I have, and I am. You deserve a life of... Not this. Not me doing this. I guess that's how I used to process my loving you. I'd fantasize about the things I couldn't give you, but if I did my job, you could get them for yourself. You could have a woman who loved you as you loved her, fully, wholly, and as you were raised to expect and to want. You could be some arms instructor in an academy somewhere, chewing out recruits and turning out polished soldiers that would count you as a mentor, an inspiration, someone to toast and tell stories about. You could have 7 kids to go home to, and they would adore you and climb up your legs until you spun them around. Anyway, that's what I wanted you to have, or something like it. I didn't get that for you. I still can't get that for you. Instead, You got months of pain and worry, and then years of grief. I held on to that idea of you being happy, and it gave me something strong to light my way. Something to live for, something to die for. Before it was for duty and for, I don't know, freedom for Venri puppies everywhere, in a general sense. But it became so very specific. So the galaxy is a place where Garrus can live in it and be happy. It was all very noble and clean and bullshit because I have put you in more danger than anybody. I can't leave you behind. I can't go out there without you beside me, and the absolute crushing selfishness of that makes me ashamed of myself. Venri. Yes. 7 children is excessive. He dragged her into his lap, ran his fingers through her hair, and waited until the giggles died down. Other than that, I can't really argue with your assessment. Everything you've said is true. I could hope for a time where we could share the moments of our lives at gentle and convenient intervals, telling stories and catching each other up on our internal lives. It doesn't surprise me that you want to see other people happy and you don't see yourself in the future. There have definitely been times that I've wanted to put my hands on you in anger and frustration and desperation. Maybe knocking you out that one time felt so good I just want to do it again. I will always have some part of my mind that wants to keep you safe by taking you far away from the danger. I am aware that you might die, inches from me, out of my reach, and I won't be able to save you, and that it would be by your choice. That day could be today, or it could be anywhere between now and 100 years from now. We're about the same age. We have about the same lifespan. If I had those 100 years with you, maybe we'd have time to tell each other everything. Maybe our biggest choice in a day would be what we're going to have for lunch. Maybe I'll have enough days to try all the things I've wanted to try with you. That's why we're doing this, right? So that other people have a future? Why not us? We should pour our energy into that future. Maybe we die. Maybe we don't. Someday we will. There hasn't been much of a future for me since you died, and I saw my inspiration fail. We now know failure is possible, if not likely. We now know the cost. I know that you can be taken from me. You know that the people you count on to get a job done can be taken from you. But not you. But not me. Never me. He pressed his mouth to the top of her head. So there is something we can do for each other. I can decide to take your inspiration and find some hope. I'm not promising that I'm going to be crazy like you, but I can replace the fear on my face with something else. Faith. You've earned that, at least. He paused for a moment, his hand tracing patterns on her back. And you can do some things for me. Like what? You will realize that if I am faltering in my faith, and you see anger or fear on my face, feel desperation in my hands or my body, catch sight of despair in my eyes, that it is not because you have failed me. You take risks I am unable to take myself. The distance between how far I will go and how far you will go is terrifying, but seeing that distance over and over, seeing you leap it, that's why I'm with you. I still don't have your instinct for that space beyond where I can go. I do need to be on the edge of that space waiting for you to come back. To catch you, to stop you from going further, or to back you up. Without me doing that, you'd be dead. You'd be dead more often. I know I could have prevented the first time, had I been there. You do your job, let me do mine. My job of keeping you alive is just as important as your job is to you. Plus, you make it hard for me at times. But you don't need to worry about managing my issues or handling my reactions to your decisions. I will come back to you. I will always come back to you, and you can have faith that if it's a few minutes or an hour or days or after we die, if there's an afterlife or reincarnation, I will come back for you. I am for you. If my will is my own, I am for you. The relief his words brought her washed through her, causing transformation. She soaked that feeling in, and her shoulders released the tension she'd been holding there. The second thing is that you're going to let me run every diagnostic process possible on that thing, and I will be in the room when you activate it, armed. That makes me sound very reasonable. I'm touched. He pulled her face to rest against his, her cheek against the rough scar and ragged edges of his mandible, leaving his hand around the back of her neck and the other hand resting on the curve of her hip. The third thing is to realize that, like you, I am not always unified in my intent, in my wishes, and my needs. You're many things to me. You can't read my face well, and maybe you never will, but you can hear it in my voice. To me, you are my commander, a person whose purpose and orders I would follow wherever they lead. You are my shepherd, the leader who involved herself in the lives of all of those who followed her, who encouraged humor and excellence. You are my Moram, the woman who recited poetry and taught me to appreciate drinking. You are my Venri, the woman I gave myself to because I could imagine no better mate, no better calling than to serve you. The last name I have for you, my Bakan, came to me when I saw your face through my scope on Omega, and I thought you were a vengeful spirit, come to take me to my death. I welcomed her. I welcomed her anger, her blame, her rage, her vengeance. While you were alive, you gave me inspiration, intimacy, laughter, purpose. But I am still struggling with what my Bakan wants from me after her death, what I want from her. You're all the things you were before, but my Bakan brought me lust. Every restriction of life or death or duty was gone when I saw my Bakan. And she offered me anger, blame, and fury if it meant I could go with her. Now, Every time I see you with death at your fingertips, mercy in your eyes, or with the blood of a dozen enemies splashing your face, while you step over and not around their bodies, you are my pecan. Sometimes I don't want to protect you. I don't want to follow you. I want to push you to the floor and watch your eyes as your knees bend, because your strength fails you when my hands are on your body. I want to strip every bit of clothing off you because you will let me, and I want to touch you, taste you until you moan, until you whimper, until you beg me to give you what you need. I want to drown in the fact that you need me. I want to watch you transform from that gold-dripping, blood-dripping elemental goddess of alternating mercy and death into the woman who bites her lip and looks at my skin. His hands had tightened on her. Her eyes had closed, and the sound of his voice spread a deep, hard flush in her skin, and a giddy feeling of losing air and losing balance rippled through her. She shuffled ideas in her mind, sifted them, and chose her response. Okay. 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 If I'm going to be the cause of your stress, it's heartening to know I can also be the solution. She stood and held her hands out to him. He took them, and she pulled him to his feet. She started to take his clothes off, and he began to reach for hers, but she slapped his hand lightly and said, "No," with her head down, concentrating on getting his clothing off without snagging on anything. He didn't try again, watched her as she moved. When she was done, she stood close, touching him with her hands, seeking the edges, the corners, sliding her palms over the curves and bends. His plates made him seem much cooler than she was, but his hide had more heat. Variations of temperature all over him. She took her time, long minutes spent in exploration, her eyes following her fingers. She stroked until she could hear his breathing speed up a little, and then a little bit more, and his heartbeat became a stronger thing through her fingertips when she strayed from his plates and touched his hide. She kept her expression neutral, lifted her eyes to his, smiled, and rapped her knuckles on his groin plates, said, "Open up." Looking at his face, she could read that expression, startled and amused with an outrush of already fast-paced breathing. She thought he was thinking of something to say, so she spread her hand, using her other hand, one finger blocking his mouth. "No talking." He stared at her for a few moments, and she tilted her head and raised a brow. It was true, he was locked up tight, and she couldn't get in unless he wanted her to. It really wasn't that much of a long shot that he'd want her to, so there was no anxiety, only anticipation, which she let show on her face. She wasn't wrong. His plates trembled and convulsed once, along with a soft groan from him, retracting to either side, and her hand slid along the edges of the opening. She smiled at him in thanks, and then looked at his cock in the revealed section of his body. No testicles. Turians were always hard, she learned. She'd learned the feel of him with her fingers, but hadn't seen him yet. Not in full light. Not at her leisure. His cock was coated with a few millimeters of a gel. She'd had her fingertips on him, but not her hands. She pressed her ear to his chest and touched him, her hand gliding over him. The gel wasn't sticky or oily. Felt slick under her fingertips and palm. Her skin stayed dry, but they began to tingle over time. There was a psychoactive glove over him that slid along her fingertips. His breathing was getting tighter, more convulsive shivers through the plates where her ear was pressed. She released him from her hands with a soft groan from his mouth, stood facing him, looked him in the eyes until she had his full attention on her face. She told him, "You can use your hands, but only your hands. You said you wanted my knees to bend, so do it." His hands came around to her face, and his fingers stroked at her collarbones, her jaw, her eyebrows, and then once on her bottom lip. He caressed her, his hands down the side of her throat. He spread his hands over her shoulders and extended his talons enough to dig into her skin. His eyes drifted closed, and then he slowly opened them. He pushed her down slowly, watching her eyes, his breathing deliberate. She watched his eyes and moved as he guided her to her knees. She closed her eyes and tested a lick over the head of his cock, her hands gliding along the sides and closing over the base. He tasted like tea, with her tongue feeling that furry feel from tea, going a little numb. She really had no idea if this would even feel good to him. She was curious, took her time, investigating with her tongue and her fingertips the spread of her palm and the line of her nail. His response cleared up her concern that she was enjoying this alone. He said her name, curiously, and then urgently, and then he was growling. He still smelled like Christmas. Well, she'd have to change that idea. She was no longer thinking like a 5-year-old that wanted to play with her presents. He smelled like promises of darker things. Blood and teeth and possession. The gel didn't scrape off or split. From a gentle probe with her nail or teeth edges, there were only indentations that flowed back into the original shape. Permanent. The medium through which Turian drugs traveled. She took him in her mouth as far as she could, her hands on the rest of his length, her fingertips and tongue on the articulations. She didn't have a goal. She just wanted to touch him. She slowly felt her fingers and tongue go numb. Her limbs began to tremble. Warmth spread through her. His talons on her shoulders were slowly working their way into her skin, in pressure and spasm. A scratching, and then a piercing, and then a run of blood in welling drops that she could feel down her back. It didn't feel like pain, just another bright spot of sensation. Something good. His hands were on her shoulders, her throat, her hair, moving, gentle, and then urgent. It all blended together until her rhythm faltered, and she thought her knees wouldn't let her stand soon if she didn't stand now. So, she made everything as clear as she could. He knew they had a safe word. He knew now that she welcomed his fantasies and would be a part of them. He would know he had permission to do what he wanted, and that she would stop him if she had to. She told him it was okay if she fainted. She stood up slowly, kissing a path up to his mouth, pulling his head down to hers. Head rush from the change in elevation, her legs not all that steady. Her heart was pounding through her veins, and she had to do something before she forgot. She kissed a path over to his ear and said, "Thank you. Your turn. Now you make the rules, and I'll follow them." He didn't tell her what his rules were. He picked her up by the waist and threw her on the bed and shredded her clothes off, licking at her skin as it was exposed. He discovered she was ticklish at the back of her knees and the arches of her feet, tickled her until she was gasping for air, then followed the sound to her mouth with his own, kissed her, the cool plates of his mouth warming against her lips, his tongue along the edges of her teeth, one of his arms supporting his weight, his other arm exploring her body from breast to hip and back again, stroking her neck, her shoulder. He trailed his hand down her stomach, dipped a finger into her heat for a moment until his finger was wet, teased her clit gently, his mouth nipping at her lips, tasting her, drinking in her soft huffs of breath and the beginnings of whimpers. If she lifted her hips to grind into his hand, he'd pull back and start over, kissing her, soothing his hand till she stopped bucking and held still. After this repeated a few times, she was panting and frustrated, and she slid her hand between her legs, and he watched her for a few long moments until her breath started to hitch and her moaning became rhythmic. And then he pulled her hand away and held it at her side. She moved her other hand, and he chuckled, caught them both in one of his, held them both away from her. He couldn't hold his weight up any longer and still touch her, so he changed position, settled between her legs, ran his hand over her upper thigh as it trembled, lowered his head, and looked at her insistently, slid his finger inside her, a cool invasion that drove her to arch into his mouth, pinching her clit against his mouth plate, pulling back with a whimper. Again, not pain, but like being shocked, sensation spreading and fading in tendrils. She'd been so close to coming so many times. The feel of him took her hard and fast, and she came with the edges of his finger plates digging into her. He pulled his finger from her, trailing it back up her body, releasing her hands and extending a talon to play with her breast, her nipple hard against the cold edge, her breath sucked into her mouth. He moved forward and lifted her thigh, kissing up the inside of her leg to the back of her knee. When she jerked again from being ticklish, he soothed her skin, scratching lightly with his talons, then bent her knee to her chest with his arm hooked under it, and she was caged in by hard and cold, his arm plates digging into the back of her knee, her thigh stretched out in a tight burn, his abdominal plates against her stomach, his mouth on hers again, demanding and hard. What had she thought? Blood and teeth and possession? That. He surged into her, and his abdomen and chest dug into her body, his sternum blade pressing the breath out of her. The now familiar, overwhelming singing of her blood was pounding at her temples, and she arched her neck back, red and black and silver dots beyond her eyelids. Panic lit up her mind for a bright second, and she almost said it. Say the word, and it'll stop. Say the word, and you can breathe, you can stretch, you can... Then the singing in her blood hit her harder and washed all thoughts away, and then it all went black. Later, she woke up and there was... What had he called it? Reverie. Reverie, pulling at her, humming in her skin. Her back was pressed to his chest, and he whispered in her ear, "Come back to me, Venri." She tried to say his name, but it came at a croak and half a question. Her throat was dry, sounding harsh, feeling different, but not painful. His sternum blade was along the line of her spine, and she flexed her shoulders to fit to him better. His arm was under her waist. His other hand lifted her hair, and he kissed her neck, shivers starting again. His hand traced over bruises and red lines on her skin, soothing, gentle. His top leg hooked over her top leg, and he pulled her leg aside, tangled in his. His hand slid down toward her clit. "Come for me, my pecan." She swallowed hard and thought, "Pecan? I'm the vengeful spirit? That's..." And she lost her thought as his hand played at her, and his teeth were at her shoulder, and his cock pushed inside her, the spasms of her body pulling him deeper. Her muscles were exhausted and twitching, shudders racking her, his growl driving her through another orgasm that was a burst of jagged red inside her head. He held her spasming hips against his body, the sharp edges of his hips digging into her ass, her spine defined by his chest. Words she could no longer understand whispered in her ear. Another steep wave of sensation dragged at her, and she was under again, swirling in the black. Minutes or hours or who knew how long later, she became aware of herself again. He was still inside her, and his arms were wrapped around her, his hand at her breast and his mouth at her ear, and she rocked in his arms until she fell asleep or blacked out again. Exhaustion and satiety dragging her down into dreams where his voice echoed and her body pulsed in response to his. She'd wake, or mostly wake, throughout the night, the blur between consciousness and unconsciousness unclear. His voice at her ear, or her skin, or her mouth. He'd be gentle, teasing, demanding, punishing, and she'd try not to pass out. And she'd fail. When she woke up much later, he wasn't far. He was asleep, his arm draped over her waist. So apparently his only rule was try not to die. Trying to get out of bed was a lesson in places she didn't even know she had places. Oh, God, everything hurt. Everything hurt. She couldn't walk in a straight line. She could barely breathe without wanting to whimper. In the past, she'd had stuff fall on her that was really big, she'd been shot. She'd been beaten up. She'd died. Died. Dying hadn't hurt this much. That was just in the lung area, and then she'd passed out and missed the actual dying part. She couldn't even remember how many times she'd passed out in the last, 6 hours? Oh, shit, she wanted to lie down on the floor and embrace the cool tiles against her face and stay there. Internally, she felt like she had a bad sunburn over a bruise, and every twist or turn of her body made her feel like crying out. She didn't. She'd provoked him, deliberately. Turians relieve stress with sex. No shit. That had better fucking be one goddamn relaxed Turian. She dragged herself to the bathroom and almost left. Her face wasn't so bad, but there were some bruises and a few scratches. Her hair was in knots. Friction had rubbed bits of her hair at different angles into bed hair clouds. Scratches and punctures and bruises were mapped out on her skin. It was a good thing that she'd learned early on that makeup was a good idea. Nobody saw her bruised and scarred unless she wanted them to. It was better strategy to look like she was more willing to bake someone a cake than beat them up. She could be underestimated and appear unthreatening when she chose. If she needed to intimidate, her mouth would do that for her. It was also very upsetting to hulking, scarred, and battle-weary Batarians and Vorcha to see her fighting them without a smear in her mascara or lipstick. She had invested in every last bit of makeup that covered bruises and discoloration and stayed the fuck on her face. Anybody who defined tough as their ideal of whatever it was got to deal with her ideal. And it was upsetting to them. She liked upsetting people that were trying to kill her. She'd paid to get her Cerberus scars removed. It was a very strategically useful vanity to be able to appear as she wanted to appear on a scale from angelic to now, abuse victim. Well, she looked like an abuse victim, but it was neither abuse, nor was she regretful in the least. She'd asked a big question and gotten a big answer. She'd earned this. She had the good painkillers, and she was going to indulge in them today because, holy Turian sex gods. Ow. Her skin wasn't as bad as she'd remembered. There had been some punctures, slashes, and bite marks that weren't there anymore. Likely Garrus had thought to apply some Metagel in her sleep. The pain was mostly muscular, but there was some joint strain. He still didn't have the hang of where she bent or did not bend. He had left one deep bite mark on her shoulder, like signing a painting. She'd leave it. The man was an artist. She suspected if she made it go away, she'd have another one soon anyway. She took a long, hot shower and leaned her face against the tile there, letting the water wash away the blood. To her credit, apparently she hadn't taken it all lying down, so to speak, and there was some blue blood in there as well. Go team! Gods, what had she done? She couldn't remember. Had he opened a vein and tried to feed her like a vampire so she could keep her strength up? Oh, don't laugh. Laughing hurts. She'd never had a sex hangover. She must learn the ways of the sex hangover. Hell, if he'd used his safe word, she didn't hear it either. Fuck that. He could have gotten away from her. She was sure of it. She imagined him yelping, "Grant! Grant!" as he scrambled off the bed and then laughed and winced again. No, that is not how that went down. The freaky Turian probably cut himself. No blood on her mouth or under her fingernails, so... yeah. Garrus, 6,532. Shepard, 0. Maybe. Shepard, 1. The painkiller slowly kicked in, and when she started feeling better, she felt a whole lot better, and noticed the thrum of reverie in her veins, and her head still. So what did it all mean, other than ow and... She'd shown him she was all in, if not all there, and he'd shown her what? Maybe he'd just shown her that he liked her body and reactions, and it wasn't more complicated than that. Not everyone was as devious as she was. There didn't need to be layers of meaning. But there were. She didn't remember words or rules she could twist or break. But just as clear as leave the bite mark, words and impressions rushed back to her. Don't let him hear again that she's imagining him with a Turian woman. Don't think it. Don't imagine that he would be better off without her. She wondered how hypnotic reverie was, because her previous doubts came back with immediate answers in her mind, in his voice. She didn't know if he'd said them, or showed her, or both. No more doubts. No more worries. He was for her, and she was for him. And what he wanted her to know was, never doubt, Venri, that I want you, that I chose you, that with you is where I want to be, that I am for you. Okay, I get it. I can give that back with both hands. He didn't want her to think she was unworthy of him. Could she stop thinking it at some point? Maybe. She still had some work to do on acceptance. But she knew better than to say it out loud to him. She'd work on not saying it to herself, if that's what he wanted. She quietly checked in with Edie. The Geth was dormant. The IFF was being installed. There was no immediate need for her to be anywhere. She fixed her face and hair and went back to bed. He looked no worse for wear at all. His outstretched wrist had one deliberate slash on it, the source of his blood. He hadn't fixed it with Metagel. She imagined him working blood rights over her while she was unconscious, explaining the smeared blood and fingerprints she'd found on her skin. He'd bound her to him in her sleep with sigils and spells. Garrus was a witch. She loved her strange, pokey, hypnotic man-witch so much. She slid back into the bed and pressed her spine against his sternum blade, rested her head on his arm, and pulled his hand back over her waist. The bite mark was right where he'd see it when he woke. He stirred only briefly, pulled her ass against him, took a deep breath, nuzzled her hair, pressed his mouth to the back of her head, and drifted back to sleep. She drifted back to sleep herself, remembering his voice, listening to him breathe. Garrus. He woke slowly, surfacing from dreamless sleep. Her neck was on his arm, her waist under his hand, and he breathed in the scent of her hair, shower scent, and her, and him. Bone-deep satisfaction was startled into, "Oh, fuck, what did I do?" And he quickly recounted the things he could remember, and knew there were things he couldn't remember. He'd intended to play with her as she'd played with him, but the edge of all that permission had cut deep. He'd expected her to stop him, and she hadn't. She'd been nothing but yes in response to everything he did. Everywhere he pushed her, everywhere he put her, everywhere he touched her. He'd had a lot of material to work with. All that time, he'd wanted her. All those fantasies, all those images. He'd done everything he could think of doing, and then thought of a few more on the spot. She'd lost the ability to speak, and he'd taught her his name over and over, taught her to say it against his mouth. He'd watched her face, watched her eyes, as his cock sought inside her, as he found ways to move the places inside her that brought those exquisite moans to her mouth, as her body shuddered under and around him, as her hands weakly clung to his shoulders. He'd heard his name on her lips in every shade of expression he could pull from her. It was the most erotic thing he'd ever done, amid the sheer, crashing reality of everything else he'd done with her. His possessiveness and pride for this woman overflowed, and he should be ashamed of himself, but what he really wanted was a copy of the surveillance in this room so he could distribute it. He wanted to address the council. He could imagine her talking to the council as he stood beside her, as she had with Saren, the bite in her voice and the sharp in her words hitting their marks. He could imagine interrupting her and telling the counselors that, by the way, this magnificent woman could be brought to forget his name and then be taught to say it again in halts and gasps against his mouth as he interrupted her and asked her to try again. He wasn't sure how this scenario could be brought to pass, but it should happen. And what would she say? She'd probably kiss him on the mandible and say, "Thank you, Garrus." The looks on their faces made it totally worth it. And then continue. Finally, her calm and acceptance working for him instead of against him. He wanted it taught in school. She'd drawn no blood, so he'd drawn his own, added it to hers, and that had driven him to some of the things he'd forgotten in reverie. The residue of those actions clung to him like lust incense. Possessive. Primal. He'd lost his own words. Should he tell her he'd lost consciousness himself there a few times, but woke up before she did? And here she was, back in bed, pristine again except for his visibly presented bite mark that he couldn't bring himself to erase, though he'd done his best with the rest of her. His wrist stung still. She hadn't fixed either of them. He nuzzled at her neck until she stirred. Asked her, "You okay?" She arched against him. "Everything's okay with me, Garrus. You okay?" "Never better. Can I get you anything?" "No, I'm good. Had a shower, talked to Edie. I'm really glad I didn't have an allergic reaction like my tongue going numb permanently. I'd find it hard to be inspiring." "All right, guys, listen up. We've got a minute to stop." He nuzzled the back of her neck. "I could speak for you." She arched back against him more. "Show off. Go back to sleep." Then he thought, so all of this was about being more honest? "Sure, Venri. You tell a lovely story about showing our feelings, and then as soon as I've shown mine, the first chance you get, you're pretending nothing hurts. It's who you are." Spirit, he loved his crazy, brave, lying woman so much.